Right, morning everyone. I acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we meet today. On behalf of the Sustainable Minerals Institute, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to the country. We recognise their valuable contribution to Australia and global society. Today's presentation, Research and Development Priorities for Minerals in Queensland, is delivered by Professor Rick Valenta, Director of the W.H. Bryan Mining and Geology Research Centre, Program Lead for Complex Ore Bodies, and Acting Director for the JKMRC. Queensland benefits from some of the world's most vibrant and productive mining research and development. To support further innovation, the Queensland Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy has released an industry-led analysis of the R&D priorities for minerals, excluding coal, in Queensland, and Rick is going to talk us through the results. The R&D statement is a collaboration between the Sustainable Minerals Institute, the Queensland Resources Council, Queensland Exploration Council, and the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy. As ever, we will have the Q&A session open during the presentation, and at the end of the session, I will then read out those questions for Rick to answer. So for those that haven't been on a webinar, if you just have a look at the bottom of the Zoom call-in, you'll see a Q&A button. Please go ahead and post your questions there. Over to you, Rick.
Thanks very much, Neville. I'll just get the screen set up here. I think I'll just get the screen set up. Yeah. So put that on. This keyboard's gone a bit funny. Right. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks to everyone online who's come in as well. As Neville said, what I'm going to be talking about today is the research and development priorities for minerals in Queensland, and there's a picture of the actual report, which is now available online. I was going to have a link to it and cleverly forgot, but I checked this morning, if you Google that title, Research and Development Priorities for Minerals in Queensland, it comes right up. So this is, as Neville said as well, and I want to acknowledge this is a collaborative effort between the Queensland Resources Council, the Queensland Exploration Council, the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy, and the SMI. So I want to start just with a little bit of a global context. And so some of these things are going to be pretty familiar to some of you. So the nature of metals demand is certainly continuing to evolve in response to new technologies and changes in the world economy, which feel a little bit like they've accelerated out of control in the last few months. And I think a lot of us would agree that the technical challenges associated with mineral production have continued to increase. On top of that, another global contextual observation is that mineral discovery is becoming increasingly difficult and driven by high technology and complex data, and perhaps most importantly, responsible and sustainable performance in the social, environment, safety, and governance areas is more important than ever before. So that's a global context. I want to talk a little bit about the local context that led to this report. So this report is an outgrowth from an earlier study that came out in 2017 called A Strategic Blueprint for Queensland's Northwest Minerals Province. It acknowledges the situation that we have in the Northwest Mineral Province, that the mines in that region are reaching the end of their life, that there's a significant infrastructure and population in that region, and that leads to a need to find resources to replace those depleting resources in order to maintain the economic impetus and the economic strength of the region. And as part of that resource, or as part of that report, there were a whole series of priorities that were identified. I'm not going to go into all of them. What I'm going to talk about is strategic, or the area that I'm going to be talking about today falls under strategic priority 1 from that report, which was to facilitate continued resource sector development. And a subsection of that is to support applied research and development in the province. And one of the recommendations from that report, in order to support applied research and development in the province, was to facilitate the development of an industry-led research and development roadmap for minerals excluding coal in Queensland. And that work has taken a couple of different forms, and the report that I'm talking about today is actually the second output related to that objective. So the first output related to that objective was actually produced by Neuchatel Partners, which was more of a sector overview that looked at industry, it looked at METS companies, it looked at research organizations, it looked at other jurisdictions and their approaches to R&D, and used that as a reflection to feed back into some thoughts about the Queensland mineral sector. So it did have industry input, but you wouldn't describe, and it had a lot of very useful information that I have to say that we borrowed from heavily with acknowledgement in our report, but you wouldn't say that it was an industry-led process because it consulted quite widely to a whole range of different stakeholders. And that really brings us to our report, which was aimed to be an industry-led report. So we had 3 objectives for that report. The first of those was to try to define the mining R&D ecosystem in Queensland. Secondly, to identify and confirm industry priorities for R&D research in Queensland, and the emphasis there is on perceived industry needs. And the reason that I'm bringing that up is that there is a case that could be made when we come to some of the recommendations. You have to remember that these are recommendations based on industry needs rather than based on an innovative and absolutely detailed high-tech understanding of the sort of granular detail of research areas. So in other words, it's expressing a need from groups that are fundamentally part of industry rather than fundamentally part of the research community. And to take all that information and to present it under a set of key themes to hopefully guide future R&D in Queensland. So the first thing I want to talk about very briefly is the Queensland ecosystem, because underlying that set of aims, to me, one of the most important things to do first is to communicate to anybody who cares to read this report that the Queensland mining R&D ecosystem is a world-class assemblage of researchers. In fact, Jonathan Lorraine in his Neuchatel report, I think, and in previous presentations, described us as the Silicon Valley of mining R&D, and I think there's a strong case for that. Yeah, there we go. So here are a couple of facts and figures. It's by no means comprehensive, but a couple of things that demonstrate the importance of Queensland in the mining R&D landscape. And the first thing to say is that there was an analysis that came out in the AusIMM bulletin a couple of years ago, looking at mining startup cities, and actually Brisbane came second only to Santiago in terms of the number of mining startups in operation. There are greater than 800 METS companies operating in Queensland, and in mining-related patent applications, we're actually number 2. We employ greater than $300 million of R&D funding to Queensland Minerals since 2016. And when you look at our universities, a very large proportion of them, in fact, over 90%, are rated in the mining-related disciplines, are rated above world standard. And in terms of generation of revenue, METS companies, for example, generate $7 billion of revenue and contribute $2.5 billion to the Queensland economy. So it's a very significant and world-class assemblage of mining R&D. And here are some innovation examples. And I want to thank Tim Napier-Munn for some of these, but also to apologize for a lot of the ones that I've left off this list, because I got a much larger list from a number of different people and had to settle on a few things. And I'm certainly not going to go through all these now, but I guess the main message is that a long-term history of world-class innovation exists in Queensland. And to put my SMI hat on for a second, in the SMI, and finally to put my JKMRC hat on, certainly from the JKMRC itself. There's my bit of bias. I'll go back to delivering this report without fear or favor. In terms of an ecosystem, again, I don't propose to, lucky for all of you, to go through this diagram in any great amount of detail, other than to show that there's a strong assemblage of government and industry organizations, not-for-profits, a very large group of METS companies, a number of metal mining companies that are actually producing or at near-term development, and a large number of explorers operating in the region. And I don't expect this diagram doesn't actually appear in the report, but one of the significant observations from the diagram that shows the explorers is that for the first time in quite a while, the top two explorers, the top two holders of exploration land in Queensland, are major companies. So for a long time, it was more dominated by smaller companies. The major companies have re-entered Queensland as a high priority jurisdiction. So that's a little bit of a snapshot to show, I guess, the context and the ecosystem in Queensland. Now what I want to do is move on to the industry priorities part of the talk. And the first thing I want to say is that the industry priorities were established through a series of interviews. We did about 30 interviews, and what I'm showing here is just the mix of people that we talked to. And if you add up mining and exploration there, you basically end up with over 2/3 of the interviewees. So there was a very strong emphasis on industry interviewees, in keeping with the aim of the program. But we also spoke to METS companies, research organizations, and a consulting group as well, partly because in addition to industry interviews, what we also did was, as you'll see in a little while, look at a number of case studies under the various different themes we established. In terms of role, this exercise was very much focused on trying to identify company level challenges, as opposed to, I guess, more detailed operation level challenges. And that's both, I guess, a positive point, but it also is potentially a criticism in terms of the level of feedback we received. So the feedback is very much at the company and senior level. And you can see that there's a large amount of people at either chief executive or senior executive level, non-executive directors, and other senior management. So quite senior roles. And when you look at one of the questions we asked, which I'll show in a second, was just to ask people, well, how important is innovation to your company? Because I think sometimes one of the things we ran into early on in this process was the perception that mining companies are not interested in innovation. They don't consider themselves to be innovators. And I don't think that's true when you look at the amount of importance that people say they place on innovation. Now, when you look at miners only, it's a little bit lower, but there's still a majority have placed a strong importance on that. What I want to do now is just talk about interview questions. And before we set up our interview questions, we talked to a number of people, including Tim, who's in the audience, but also members of the SMI Production Center's advisory board. And some of the questions are listed there. I'm not going to read all of these questions, because what we found, and I think you often find this in a process like this, is that the the very large list of questions distilled itself down to a smaller amount that were more important. And these were the questions that we really tried to gather and ended up getting the most important feedback from every group. And probably the first one is the most important one, which was just what keeps you awake at night? On the premise that when you talk to somebody in a senior role in a company, usually what's keeping them awake at night is the thing that they would like to have help with. And the only thing that I could think of really that research perhaps directly couldn't help with a global pandemic, which I didn't think of at the time, I have to say. And we also can't help with the vagaries of the market going up and down, but almost everything else is potentially a subject for research. So that what keeps you awake at night question was one of the most important ones we asked. And even though we discussed with each interviewee directly what they thought were areas of fruitful research, I think we got more useful feedback on areas of fruitful research from the question, what do you think the mining industry is going to look like in 10 to 15 years' time? Because when you get answers from experienced industry professionals in that area, you often, even if they don't say you need to do this, you get a much better feeling of where they see themselves in 10 to 15 years' time, and a feeling for the things that you might have to do to help them get to that spot. And the other one, which is also part of it's a little bit related to another aim of the report, was the final question, which was, what would your advice be to Queensland groups involved in mining-related R&D and or innovation? And I thought that we got a lot of useful and if not surprising, then feedback that was a little bit different than we thought it was going to be. So when we look at research themes, before starting on this exercise, there were nobody probably will be too surprised to hear that there are a large number of roadmaps out there for mining-related R&D. I've said to a few people, we're pretty much up to Pussy's Bow with roadmaps, and they're often driven to a certain extent, and probably ours could face the same criticism. They're driven a little bit by the cognitive bias of the person who's putting that roadmap together. But we did come up with a number of themes into which we tried to divide our feedback and tried to categorize the areas of importance and organize that feedback. And so that's the group there. So commercial drivers, which was really adapting to and capitalizing on the business environment and changes in business environment that we're going through. And then the digital transformation, the transformation that if you go to any mining conference, you're probably going to see digital transformation in the title, that there are companies that are taking what they used to do in an analog way and now doing it in a digital way. And then really probably the greatest area of research focus that we, oh my God, not the dreaded restart. The greatest area of previous research focus, which is finding, mining, and extracting, all of the things that the industry does as part of its core work and has done for 100 years or more. And then an area that I'm calling footprint, which is really around the increasingly important environment, social, governance challenges, and the need to continue to achieve mineral supply whilst reducing the environment, social, and governance footprint of projects. And then an area that we've called New Horizons, around the new economy minerals. So changes in the commodities that we're going to need in order to meet demand for electric vehicles and batteries and wind farms and the new I guess set of technologies that are becoming increasingly important. And then finally, and certainly very timely in a Queensland context, is health and safety. So the need to continually innovate to ensure the safety of workers. So what I'm going to do now is really just go through those themes one by one with some point form. So there's going to be a lot of point form here. My apologies for that, but I'll try to place some color on some of the observations. And I want to start in each case with an assemblage of quotes from the interviewees, because there are some interesting ones. The first of this, obviously, the recognition that you have to really focus your innovation. If you try to do every single thing, you're probably going to get nothing done. One that's a little bit different, but it's around increasing commercial realities is, one observation from a CEO that as time has gone on, more from a regulatory point of view, it's become harder and harder to put mines into production. And I think people might argue on the other side of that's a good development. It means that we are making sure that we're decreasing our footprint. And another, I thought, quite relevant quote there was the need to identify the things that can actually change the dial, that can actually change the situation for a company and focusing the innovation there. So when we look at commercial drivers, and what I'm going to do with each of these, in this section, with each of these categories, is to go through challenges, then what interviewees thought the world was going to look like in 10 to 15 years' time, some areas of research that come from that, and potential impacts, and then a couple of notes about the case study subject for each of these areas. So in terms of commercial realities for companies, one of the things that came back again and again, particularly for the Northwest Mineral Province, but for other areas as well, was the challenges of infrastructure. So the cost and availability of power, the cost and availability of water and other aspects of infrastructure. The second of those points relates to the limited window of opportunity often faced by exploration companies. So we say on the one hand, there's this great need to make further discoveries, but the feedback from a corporate point of view that I was getting from companies was that when you take the Venn diagram of investor appetite, regulatory and seasonal challenges, you end up with a very tiny window in order to actually get done the work that your investors want you to do. And there was also a challenge really talked about by a lot of companies around regulation, around the increasing need for them to comply with a larger and larger set of rules in a more and more rigorous way. And then the other thing that was a little bit more specific was around R&D incentives, that there's been a system for a long time of tax relief for support of R&D, and there was a general feedback from companies that support of R&D, or that those tax incentives have become ineffective. They become over-regulated and too risky to actually take up because of the risk of a year or two later having them refused. So in terms of a future state that people identified, there was a general agreement that despite all these challenges, that there was a strong demand for commodities going into the future. And nobody thought, on top of all this, nobody's going to want our copper or our dysprosium or whatever they're looking for, gold. There's a feeling that there was going to be a strong demand going into the future. And you'll see this point come up a few times. Surprisingly, quite a few industry representatives were in agreement with what we've heard from a number of different people in the last little while, which was the feeling that we will be doing more value-add processing in the future, that the products we'll produce won't just be something that we put onto a ship and send off, that there'll be a more creative energy mix, and hopefully that there'll be better incentives for R&D going into the future. A lot of people felt that there's going to be a need to be more transparency around everything to do with their operations, and that feeds into a number of the other themes as well. And that the bigger explorers point is around the fact that as exploration moves undercover, it becomes more and more difficult for small, market-dependent explorers to be able to do meaningful work. It just, things take too long and they're too expensive. And so there was a feeling that maybe as exploration moves increasingly undercover, that exploration companies will on the average get bigger. So in terms of some of the research directions, and these are, remember, these are around commercial drivers. So you know, one of the things that came up was, is there a way that we can refine the way that regulators and companies interact in order to make that process happen more quickly, but retain the rigor that you need in order to ensure that companies are behaving responsibly. There was also a suggestion from a couple of people that it's a little bit confusing, that next term, mine development practice. What was meant there was a study of mine development challenges and approaches that could be gleaned from a wide number of jurisdictions, so that when a company comes to the stage of producing a pre-feasibility or a feasibility study, they're not starting from square one. And when a country which might be you know, maybe a Queensland-based explorer is doing development in a country that has less of a regulatory regime that we have, that there's actually a base of information for them to come up with an understanding of how this whole process works. And there was a feeling that that sort of information doesn't really exist to the extent it should now. Feeding back into the infrastructure theme, looking at infrastructure delivery. Another one that we'll come back to again and again is around mining people. The fact that, and this is probably should have even more importance, and I've got it on here, that the mix of skills and the mix of people is going to be different going into the future. It's already changing, and research in that area was brought up as by a few people as being important. And the other point that was interesting was the need to identify to a clearer extent the areas that in which companies are competing on the one hand, and the areas in which they should be cooperating on the other hand. So there was a feeling from companies themselves that they were treating some things as being competitive when really they should be cooperating on them. And in terms of impacts, of course, the main things that we would like to see coming out of this sort of set of research would be an increase in value-added processing, mitigation of some of the infrastructure challenges, additional community support, and increased business innovation. And the example that I actually used, or the case study in the report around this, and I'm only going to talk very briefly about it, is the Center for Met's Business Innovation. So I talked to Professor Rachel Parker, who's now moved to UQ and is the director of the Global Change Institute. But basically, one of the quotes from that interview was the Center for Met's Business Innovation really works with engineers and scientists on the uptake of their technologies to understand better how to actually carry out the work that they need to do in order to make sure that their technologies actually make a difference. So we'll move on now to the digital transformation. So a couple of quotes there. The observation that we're all thinking that it's going to be happening any day now, but one day we're going to wake up and it will have happened, and we probably won't have noticed till it did. Another quote that came back from this was the general feeling that, and I think this is quite a widespread one based on my experience, that this probably is the next big thing, but how do we actually do it? How do we get on board with this? And then I guess a similar sort of theme to that is the recognition that probably many minds are in the dark ages still from that perspective. I can see I'm going to have to speed up a bit. So in terms of challenges, one of the big ones there is around the workforce. The fact that as mines become more and more digital, the skill set of people working in those mines is going to have to become more and more digital. And a lot of people brought up the fact that all of our assets are out there already and they're not digital. So getting legacy assets into the digital world is going to have its own challenges. And then there were some of the ones that probably people will have seen elsewhere around communication, interoperability of machines, the need for sort of partial transformations in some cases, and transaction models in that cases. There were some infrastructure challenge, or some questions for bulks who are doing, say, hundreds of contracts a year. Is there a way that they can make those happen more easily, for example, with blockchain? In terms of a future state, I think everybody realized that we are going to wake up one day and find out that we actually have done the digital transformation, or that it's well along. Automation is going to happen, and allied with that, there's going to be more off-site and remote work, and I think a lot of us have already started to experience that. That's going to happen in the exploration space as well, the whole use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and we'll probably see a number of hybrid solutions for legacy assets. And then the research directions, around future skill sets. How do we work remotely in an effective way? How do we improve interoperability? And then the specific things relating to exploration, targeting, mine and process control, and general digitization of mines. And of course, the impacts there, the obvious ones are improved, more efficient, lower cost exploration, mining, and processing, a positive and productive workforce transition as opposed to a sort of wrenching one, and an orderly transition for legacy mines. And the case study for this one was Petra Data Science, who are doing a lot of work using machine learning and optimization, working with mine site data of various different types, as one example of a number of groups who are doing this sort of work. So if we go on to finding, mining, and extracting, a couple of quotes. From an exploration point of view, in the end, it's all about discovery, coming back again to upgrade processing, and also another exploration related one that we're still not able to effectively explore undercover. So some of the challenges there, commercialization, that's more of a Met specific one. If you've come up with an innovation, how do you actually turn it into a commercial reality? A specific Queensland-based challenge is, how do we mine effectively and process effectively on a declining asset if you've got a mine that's reaching the end of its life? And then the challenges that have already been mentioned around energy, water, and infrastructure. How do we deal with those better? Again, the challenge and cost of discovery, and I guess the need for government support of some of these aspects. So in terms of a future state on those, there was a feeling that, and again, this is nothing new, but there was a confirmation from the interviewees that mineral supply in the future is going to come from lower grades, increasingly from mine waste. We felt there was going to be an increasing role for the met sector. People brought up things like equipment as the combined role of equipment vendors also lending virtually consultation roles. There was a feeling that in the future we'll be looking at smaller and stranded deposits as opposed to looking for the absolute tier one world-class mega project, and also a hope and feeling that some of the transformative technologies like in situ recovery and related technologies will actually become a reality. And so the research directions in this case, and all these are quite high level, but we're going to continue, as we have always done, to have to work very strongly on lowering the costs of mining production. But I think focusing increasingly on reducing footprint through reduced energy, water usage in the area of exploration, covered exploration, and a strong direction in getting more value from existing data, whether it's exploration data, whether it's mining data, whether it's processing data, and that in order to produce from smaller stranded assets, we're going to have to understand variability better and develop more flexible mining and processing. And the hoped for impacts from that are increased discovery, smaller economic production from smaller operations, that we're unlocking deposits that couldn't previously be put into production because of their complexities, which relates back to our complex ore bodies program, through transformative technologies of some sort, and using those sorts of approaches to achieve successful production from lower grade deposits and mine wastes. So the case study for this one was Core Resources, who appeared on the innovation list in a couple of different areas. And one quote from their interview, it certainly doesn't cover everything that they do because they do a lot of different things, but the quote from the CEO was, "We're good at solving complex metallurgical problems," and they have proven so. So we'll now go on to footprint. And this was one of the more, I guess, sit back and wonder quotes that I got as part of the interview series, which was, "The interview social license to operate has gone." And it's a sobering thought that that's a feedback that an industry representative is willing to give to an exercise like this. Also a quote around the importance of water, and at the same time an expression from another company CEO. And this is a quote taken slightly out of context. What they were saying essentially was, "We're very happy to be part of cleaning up our legacy sites over time." The other part of the quote was really an expression that it was difficult to understand exactly what sort of requirements were being asked of them. So in terms of challenges, one of the big challenges that got listed by quite a few people was societal perceptions of mining. Miners certainly realize that there's a job to be done there. And performance expectations in terms of environment, social governance performance, challenges around improving stakeholder relationships, the acknowledgement that stakeholder relationships are often not where they should be, dealing with regulation. And the final point there was I've just said valuation because to explain what I meant by that was going to take too much text, but it was basically it was around the statement. The longer version of that valuation statement was, how do we do the right thing given that we will lose money doing that and we have no incentive to do it? That was how I would summarize the bit of feedback I got. And it's not somebody speaking for the whole industry, but it was that sort of feeling that we want to do the right thing, but it causes us a financial loss and we gain no benefit from it. So and you know, that feeds back into, I think, the need to define ways to demonstrate that valuation, I think. So in terms of a future state, one thing that was identified by quite a few companies was the importance of investors going forward in the area of footprint, environment, social, and governance. That in addition to regulators, investors are going to be governing, or at least placing strong feedback on companies in terms of their environment, social, governance performance. And that the expectations, there was certainly a realization that even if people felt the expectations were high now, we're moving higher. So nobody was under the illusion that we could, or at least, you know, nobody really believed that we're going to be able to go back to the way we were, you know, decades and decades ago, that wasn't really an option, and that there's going to be a need for improved performance, a need for continued reductions to mining footprint, and a number of people brought up the need to achieve carbon neutrality. And this is the point where I made when I was actually listing these out and looking at what I listed, you know, I would have thought that experts in community social performance, environment, and mine waste would look at this list and go, well, duh. I guess it's something that clearly a lot of different groups, and certainly our group, are doing. So the research directions that came out of this bit of feedback all I can say is that those of you who are working in this area, your work has been confirmed as vitally important by the mining industry. And the impact, of course, of improvements in these areas will be, and this was also brought up by a few people, the need to, or the possibility of redefining mining as a clean, high technology industry, which is not the way it's perceived now, through achieving lower environmental footprints, and also an acknowledgement that sustainability and social performance is actually doing pretty well. And the case study that's in the report around this is Voconic, which was a spin out from CSIRO, and they're a group that basically the quote from Kieran Moffat was, they're helping companies to step forward into the space between mining and communities, and they're using technology in an innovative way to do that. New horizons are all around new commodity minerals. So some of the quotes there that from a market point of view, actually, you know, new horizon, new economy minerals aren't doing that well right now, but everybody realizes that the longer term potential for growth is there. One of the observations that was made is that in comparison to copper, lead, zinc, gold, you know, specialty metals really are different. They require a much more specific understanding of the entire sort of chain, from exploration to mining to processing to sales and marketing, and it's an area where mining companies are feeling a little bit exposed. And then again, this point about if you're not actually doing some sort of upgrade processing, you're just running a quarry. So I looked at this list again and I thought, so we've pretty much got New Horizon minerals sorted out, aside from the fact that we lack funding, knowledge, opportunities, understanding, and data. So if you leave those aside, we're just about pretty well set up. In terms of a future state that people saw for this, there is great potential for, in Queensland, for a strong, for a strong industry in this area that includes value-added processing, that in the future, these commodities really are going to be increasingly important and see increasing demand. And part of that equation is going to be looking at a variety of sources, including wastes of various different types, recycling, and even potentially seabed minerals, if that can be done in an environmentally responsible way. And there's an opportunity there for Queensland companies to pursue those sorts of opportunities. And so the research directions in this area were very easy, because they consist almost entirely of fairly low-hanging fruit, where there's been very little attention paid to these, and that attention is growing. But in terms of basic research and compilation, looking at new economy mineral contents in old mines and occurrences, support for innovative processing, and looking at the footprint implications of all these approaches. And that's something that is now, since actually the production of this report, much more in focus than it was at the time when we were putting this report together. And the potential impact there is to have have Queensland as a world-class supplier, processor, possessor of knowledge in this area, and to develop a new downstream industry as part of it. And the case study from that is Pure Battery Technologies, where they've developed, actually, they've commercialized an innovation that's come from the University of Queensland, looking at cheaper and more environmentally responsible recovery of cobalt and nickel from metal hydroxide intermediate products from cobalt, nickel, copper processing. And Bjorn Zakarski's quote on that is, "We're making tomorrow's batteries for cars, for energy storage, better, cheaper, and more environmentally friendly." And then the final one is around health and safety. So this is one where the feedback was a little bit different, because I found that most of the industry representatives that we talked to actually didn't raise safety as being something that was keeping them awake at night, which was, I thought, was an interesting observation in itself. So you can see there's some quotes here. Obviously, it's keeping people in Queensland awake at night for very sad reasons. And so there's a couple of quotes here from the recently released Brady Review that has summarized a lot of the history of safety and in mine safety in Queensland in the last little while. It also incorporates feedback from a safety reset industry meeting that I was involved in the middle of last year. So you know, there's a recognition, I guess, that there is a fatality cycle from the Brady Review, that unless we do something different, we're not going to deviate too much from the rate of fatalities that we're currently experiencing, and that you know, safety problems are very behavioral, and that the systems that we're operating are possibly part of the problem. So some of the challenges that came out of that report, but also part of the consultative processes we were involved in, was around you know, a whole range of things like risk management. Particulates came up quite often. The need for companies to cooperate on safety data and training. The complexity of operating within those systems as being something that is actually counterproductive to safe operation. Pressure faced by certain roles in the safety hierarchy, if you want to call it that, and the amount of paperwork. And in the future, people saw that there were going to be tighter standards, new standards around automation and new areas of operation, a need for increased transparency around safety, faster analysis of risk data that might allow improved prediction of hazards and accidents before they occur, and increased cooperation. And some of the research directions there that really repeat some of the items in the future state, and really the impacts, and this feeds back into one of the conclusions of the Brady report. The desired impact really there is a transformational improvement in safety performance, and that's the way he put it, that in order to deviate from that line that we're on of you know, a certain amount of deaths every 5 years, we're going to have to make a transformational improvement. And obviously the potential for Queensland to continue to be, because it already is a world-class training and research center in this respect. And the case study that we looked at for that was SmartCap Technologies, who actually developed a system to allow people operating machinery to detect microsleeps before they happen when they're building up. And the quote from that was that they've installed this system in a number of different areas, and Tim Eckert said basically they've never had, once they've installed that system, they've never had a fatigue-related incident on a site equipped with the system. And this is an example too that feeds back into another bit of feedback I got from other companies, which was in the case of SmartCap Technologies, they're now taking that technology out of the mining industry and taking it into other industries like the trucking industry in the US. So that's a summary that I don't expect anyone to read to say that in the report there's a summary that looks at near-term approaches, longer-term research approaches, and potential impacts. The final thing I want to talk about is some of the advice to researchers, which I thought was pretty interesting. One of these first ones was, and I got this back from quite a few people, show a business case and be clear on the benefit and the change for the company. So it's perhaps surprising to some people that this is not something that's done. And I've had the feedback from researchers that, well, you know, it's very, very difficult to do, so we don't even try. But it's really something that was quite strong feedback from some of the industry representatives we talked to. As another obvious one, but it's clearly one where people have experienced the opposite situation. That is that if you're going to come talk to us, why don't you make sure that what you're working on is actually something we care about? And that the value of the innovation that you're talking about introducing is actually significant to us. And in order to, there was a general feedback that in order to do that, researchers should be strengthening their contacts with operations. They should be in each other's pockets long enough so that they truly understand what the problems are. And I guess those of us who live in the applied research environment think, yes, well, of course, that's something that we have to do all the time. I'm not going to go through all these other ones. I think those were the ones that stood out to me as being the most important. So I'm running out of time, but that's all right. I'm running out of slides too. So I just want to get to some acknowledgements. So supervision and feedback on this project was from Elizabeth Billing from the DNRME. And all these interviews, or virtually all these interviews, were a team, myself and Dr. Jen Thompson from the DNRME. And it won't be a surprise to anybody who's done an exercise like this that having two people along on a set of interviews is probably 4 times as good as having one person. And so thanks to Jen for her contribution to both the interviews and the subsequent analysis, for the case studies from the various people that I've mentioned already, and also for a number of colleagues here at the SMI and also from the QRC for feedback. And of course, acknowledgement and thanks to all of the people who participated in interviews or otherwise delivered feedback as part of this process. So thanks very much for your time.
Right, Rick, am I back on? So thank you very much, Rick. And this is the first seminar we're doing in what I think is a hybrid or blended way, where we have an audience in the seminar room with Rick and I here, whereas all the other ones we've done sort of separated and virtually. So it's going to be a little bit tricky in terms of doing the Q&A, and I'll do my best to make sure that we get through that unscathed. What I'd like to do while those online are busy popping your Q&A questions into the Q&A box is I'm just going to start with a question, if there are any from the audience here in the seminar room. I don't know if there are any questions for Rick. If you wouldn't mind grabbing the microphone and
Want to go ahead?
Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
thanks.
Okay, Tim Napier-Munn. Rick, thanks very much for that. That sounds like a very, very useful exercise, and I hope it doesn't end up like all these reports gathering dust on a shelf. So one of my questions would be, what's next and how do you turn it into something useful? But in terms of the content, what I'm interested in is what your interviewees said about the skilling of the workforce. Clearly something came through about the need for skills in the new areas of data and digitization and so on. But I think our industry has a problem with how it values graduates because of this grotesque cycle we see when they all get fired when there's a downturn, and then they accuse the universities of not producing enough when the upturn comes. Did you get any kind of a feeling for how the industry wants to see the development of its graduates for these new challenges that were encountered?
There are quite a few different aspects that one could talk about on that front. I guess one was around, not so much around graduates, but more around the extent to which the need for retraining was going to be important, that the evolving mix of skills meant that there was going to be a need for shorter term, more nimble training for perhaps existing staff, rather than training at the graduate level. Another thing that came up in a more general sense was that the trend that for remote operations, it was increasingly difficult to get people to come out to those remote operations. And then, in the areas around the digital mine, I guess, obviously there was a feedback that that the need for, I guess, computer, electrical engineering, that skills relate to that digitization, skills that relate to that digitization process were going to be more and more important.
All right, thank you, Rick. I will take a question from online, and this one's quite intricate, so I'll read it slowly and then we can unpack it. A decade ago, I suggest a report titled Research and Development Priorities for Minerals in Queensland would have had a much stronger technical focus. So the question is, what does the broader view of challenges and R&D priorities in this report say about the changes in focus of mining companies and the way they plan and conduct their business?
This, thank you. Was that from Dorothy Dix?
No.
It's a very important question because, for a long time, and you can see from the list of mining innovations that have happened in Queensland that the main innovations have been in the finding, mining, and extracting area. But what we're finding increasingly is that and as an industry, we've been fantastically good at doing that sort of thing. We've driven down costs. We've created new efficiencies. We've been enormously successful in that area, to the extent where we're now in a situation where the things we're rubbing up against are much more around environmental challenges, around market challenges, around infrastructure, and social challenges that require things that, as engineers and geologists and traditional mining industry leaders, were much less well equipped to deliver. Changing the way our company views the value of innovations in those sorts of areas, and changing the way we do business in order to increase our chance of being able to put mines into production. So I guess that's been really the source of the change in emphasis, that yes, there's still a need for technical innovation, but the need for technical innovation has moved away from a sole cost focus and into a much broader focus that links back into some of these other factors.
Thanks, Rick. Any other questions from the audience? All right, Lisa.
Lisa Forbes from JKMRC. So in your talk, you've highlighted that the image of the mining industry and its poor image is currently a big concern for a lot of people. And that's certainly, we've been seeing a lot of that nowadays with, the Extinction Rebellion, people staging protests, etc. And that the mining industry is seen as dirty, low tech. But when you walk into any mining operation anywhere in the world, that's what you see. You see a dirty, low-tech operation that shares a lot in common with the set of an average slasher movie. Rust pipes, dirt, random steam emanating from anywhere. Has anybody considered that perhaps better housekeeping beyond safety, trip and fall hazards could help rehabilitate the image of mineral processing operations?
I won't say that specifically got brought up as an issue. What did get brought up, which I thought was quite interesting by a couple of people, was the observation that for mining companies and their families, or for people who work in the mining industry and their families and their stakeholders, what would be the downside of actually increasing the transparency, increasing the visibility of the mining operation, setting up cameras inside the concentrator, or in a whole different set of areas, so that if people were saying, oh, I wonder what such and such a mine is doing today, that they would actually be able to go and see online what real people were doing in a real mining operation. And yes, people might be able to scrutinize those cameras and say, oh, that person's doing something wrong. But at the same time, it would probably drive companies to do some of the things that you brought up. So it was something, that aspect of it was brought up by interviewees.
All right, Rick, I'm cognizant we've got 2 minutes and I've got about 10 questions online. So we're probably not going to get to all of them. What we will do is we will reply to all the questions. If you've put your name in the box, we can reply to them. We will try and get through as many as we can quickly now, Rick. So this one is one that I think is pretty close to all of us. It's often noted that the most important challenge in commercializing innovation is to secure reference demonstration sites. How do we engage industry to be part of the innovation challenge and provide opportunities to trial and showcase innovation?
Yeah, that's that sort of broad theme, certainly did come up you know, in the question around, you know, in the advice to researchers section. And I guess all I would say there, and this is going to be probably a slightly frustrating answer for the person who asked the question, that is to repeat the feedback that I got from quite a few industry representatives, which was, if you can say to, if you can demonstrate the value of doing that test on their site, and the relevance to that operation of carrying out that test, then that, you know, based on the feedback we got, that's you know, that would go some way towards getting a better chance of being able to carry out that sort of test on site. I wouldn't say that any sort of ideas came up around, say, external government support specifically focused on that, but that would be the other possibility, would be support for example, technologies that are ugly ducklings, that have great potential but just have languished. And if there was some sort of form of external support to get a test done that wouldn't be a cost to the company, you know, maybe that's something to be dealt with. But it's not something that was discussed in the interviews.
All right, Rick, I'm going to ask one last question, which I'm going to just bring two questions together, because they both talk about what is unique in Queensland that came out of the report, and then also how could this be applied to interstate or internationally. So was anything that came out that was unique, but also anything that could be applied?
I think one thing, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily absolutely unique to Queensland, but what I would say is that the social challenge, or I guess you would call it the social challenge in Queensland, is a little bit different to what you would expect it to be in a lot of other jurisdictions, in the sense that the operations on the whole in remote Queensland enjoy local community support. You know, maybe that's overstating things, but I think in general, the level of local community support and involvement in operations is quite high. That one of the bits of feedback we got was that, you know, the main resistance comes from areas distant from the areas of community support. So companies are devoting a lot of effort to, as they should, to gaining local community support and doing a good job of that, but finding that it doesn't make any difference when you know, communities far away from them have the opposite view. And so improvements in dealing with that is something that probably, you know, I wouldn't say it's unique to Queensland, but it's a little bit different to the traditional you know, to the traditional problem. You know, in terms of every jurisdiction has its unique mix of commodities, I guess, but I wouldn't say that there's anything, you know, distinctive about Queensland from that respect. So that's really the main answer I can think of there.
All right, well, Rick, thank you very much. I'm just going to wrap up the session, and Rick, thanks very much for today's seminar. And to everybody, thank you very much for dialing in, and those that are with me here at Indrapilli site at JKMRC, thanks for joining me in the room. We have had an incredibly busy 6 months as we've transitioned to the new world of work. And we've put on a number of webinars and transitioned a lot of our activities online. We are going to take a 2-week break now. It's aligned with the school holidays, and quite a number of people within the Institute are going to take a little bit of a breather as we prepare for the second 6 months of the year. So we look forward to catching up with you all again on the 14th of July. Tuesday the 14th will be the next webinar that we'll run. In the meantime, if you have missed any of the previous webinars, they are all online. And if you have any suggestions of topics that you would like us to cover across the whole entire mining value chain, because the Institute covers all that area, we'd be very, very glad to hear from you and glad to organize a webinar for those particular topics. There were a couple of questions just asking, is the report available? Yes, it is online. At the beginning of the chat, Rick said if you go online and just Google the title, it will come up. If you can't find it, please just drop us an email and we'll make sure you can get a copy. So thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you on the 14th of July.